With the newest release of Lightroom, Adobe introduced a new tool called color grading. They actually used to have a tool that was really similar in the prior versions, and they called it split toning. Even if you did use that before, you might still be a little confused as to how the color grading tool works. First, I'd like to answer the question of why you would use this in the first place. If you have a multi-camera setup, or if you're a wedding photographer and have a second shooter that's using another type of camera, or even sometimes just a different lens, you'll sometimes see a lot of color variation from one picture to the next, even if nothing's changed as far as your settings, lighting, or environment goes. I tend to use this color grading now as more of a color correction tool. And honestly, I think that would have been a more appropriate name for it, as actual color grading like you would see people use in video editing. It's generally used to achieve a certain mood or aesthetic, and you can use it either way. I mean, neither one is necessarily the right way to use it. So I would just suggest playing around with it after watching this video and just kind of see what you can do, what it's capable of. As I said, I'm going to show you how to use it to do your initial color correction, so you'll have kind of a clean slate when you go to adjust your white balance later on. So let's take a look at the color grading tool under the Develop module and see what we've got. You'll see we have 3 color wheels here. They're labeled shadows, midtones, and highlights. I assume that you know what each of those are, but let's take a look at this image broken down into those 3 individual parts so you can see exactly what areas of the image the color wheels will be affecting. In this version of the photo, the black areas here represent the shadows, the gray areas represent the midtones, and the white represents the highlights. Essentially, this is how Lightroom sees your image when it comes to the color grading. This is kind of how it breaks it down, how it analyzes it in order to figure out where each of these are. So going back to the original, I've already done most of my edits, and just about the only other adjustment I might make here before I'd call this one good is to fix the white balance. Before I touch that at all, I want to fix any areas that might have color casts. I shoot with Fuji X-T2 bodies, but I've owned several Nikon cameras, and I've shot weddings where I've had second shooters using Canon and Sony. They're all great cameras, but sometimes it's hard to get the colors to match up when you want everything to look cohesive. Essentially, my goal with any of the combination of camera bodies and lenses is to make the finished product look like they were all taken with the same camera. So when I can get all of that to match before I start shifting the white balance, I'm saving myself a lot of time, because that can get really frustrating later on. Anybody who shoots weddings and has edited pictures from multiple cameras kind of knows the headache that can cause. But I like to have a little finer control over what I'm doing, so I'm going to use these 3 dots here instead. And before I do that, I'm going to make a virtual copy of my image. That way I can do some comparisons later on. So let me do that real quick here. I'm going to go create virtual copy. And now that is the image I'm going to be working on. And it'll preserve my original. So now I've got my virtual copy, and now I'm going to go back to the dots, and you'll see when I click on each one, I have a bigger version of that color wheel that I had before for each one, but now I also have sliders to control my hue and saturation, whereas before I basically would just take the dot and slide it around. The closer I get to the edge, the higher the saturation, and then the more I move it around the color wheel, that's essentially like adjusting the hue. You can do it both ways. I just like having these fine controls over it. Now my first step in this here is to go to each one, and I'm going to crank the saturation all the way up to 100 on each. And yes, this looks terrible. It'll get better, I promise, later on. Once I've done that, I'm going to make sure I'm starting with the shadows, so I'm going to go back to here. I don't know that particularly matters in general, but it helps me to start with the shadows. It's just the way I work. So now I'm going to move the hue slider around on the shadows, and what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try to get the image to look as blue as possible, or the shadows at least to look as blue as possible. Why blue? I don't think that necessarily matters either, but we're mostly trying to get all 3 to be the same hue, so they all kind of blend together as much as possible. Blue just happens to be the color that I always use, so that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to take the hue slider and I'm going to drag that around. We're in greens now, and went a little too far. Now I'm into magenta, and bring that back to there. Once I've done that, I'm going to make sure that I'm starting back with the shadows, and you don't necessarily have to do that, but it works better for me to start at the shadows, so that's where we're going to go. And we're going to take the hue slider and I'm going to move it so where the shadows become as blue as possible. And you don't have to use blue. You could probably use just about any shade, I think. But I like to use blue because, once again, that's just what I'm used to working with. See, I've gone a little too far here. I'm in magenta, so I'm going to move it back to blue. There's pretty good. I can always come back and adjust that hue a little bit if I need to. But I'm going to go to my midtones here, and I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to drag those around until I get those. Now they're in kind of magenta again, so I'm going to back those. I don't want to go too far into green. We'll stay there for the time being, and then I'll do that with the highlights as well. And I'm going to go back through one more time and just play around with those sliders just a little bit to make sure I'm where I want to be. Because this right here is what is going to give this an even color cast across the whole image. And if you do this for, say, one image from each camera, you can probably get everything to match and then just sync those settings across. So, and now that we have everything matching up pretty well with the same color through all three, we're going to move the saturation sliders back down to something that looks more natural. And I personally like to keep it between like 5 and 10, somewhere around there. Let's go with 10 on each of these just to start. And if we need to go a little bit more, we can, or a little bit less, I should say. Okay, so you may not see a whole lot of difference in this from what we started with. I'm going to bring the other one up so we can compare them at the same time. So I'm going to go in my library module here, and let's compare these two side by side. You can see in this one, everything looks a little bit more magenta, especially on her skin. And yes, that kind of cooled her skin off a little bit, but I'm going to make the whole image look a little warmer later on with a white balance. Like I said, what I'm after here is I want to get kind of cohesion in color across all of my images. So even if you don't see a whole lot of difference here, it will make a difference later on if you would be editing a whole bunch of images at once, especially if they're from like multiple cameras. So now that part's done, I'm just going to focus on our edited shot again. So just this one here. I'm going to go back to the develop module. And now we're going to go to the basics tool, or the basic tools here. And now we can fix the white balance. And just like with the color grading, how I dragged the slider to an extreme, I'm going to do the same thing with the temp slider. I'm going to bring the temperature pretty far this way into the blues. Once again, looks terrible, but what I'm looking for here is anything that is really green or too magenta-y, and that's what I will fix with the tint slider. So if I move it this way, I'll get a little bit more into the magenta, and essentially I'm going to drag it until I think it was actually probably in a decent spot before I started adjusting. But that looks pretty good there. That looks pretty evenly blue across those. Now I'm going to go back to the temperature slider and move it to the right until the image looks as warm as I need it to. So I'm going to slowly move it here, and the image does, there is still a little bit of a green color cast, so I'm going to take my tint slider and back it off this way a little bit more again. Okay, and now the image looks nice and warm. This photo was taken during sunset, so I want it to be a little warmer and just kind of matching that golden light that I had that day. But that's pretty much it. That's how I use the color grading tool to get all my pictures to look more cohesive. And one last thing I want to do is I want to compare the original with this one, where I have adjusted the white balance the same, but have not adjusted the color grading on the original. So I'm back to my library module here. And let's bring up the other one side by side. Now they both have the exact same white balance settings now. And this one, to me at least, it looks a lot more red than I want it, especially kind of in her hair and her skin kind of have a lot more of a red cast than I want. This one was the one we edited with the color grading. If you prefer this version, I would say don't adjust your color grading. I prefer this. This looks more like the final edit that I would deliver. But if you prefer this one, or you just want to make it easier to keep cohesiveness across all of your images, especially like I said, if you're using multiple cameras or multiple lenses, that hopefully you can get the color to even up across those using the color grading. So I hope you found this tutorial to be pretty useful. Even if you don't use the method that I use to edit, hopefully you at least learned how to use the color grading tools and kind of what they're capable of. But I suggest just playing around with them a bit more. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment, and I will try to address those and answer any questions you have. But I will see you next time.